The capture. The war had dragged across the stars for years, but in this corner of the galaxy it came to a brutal climax, as the alien fleet known as the Threx Dominion descended upon a small human outpost. Their ships were sleek and cold like blades of obsidian cutting through the black sky, while the human defenders held the line with battered vessels and stubborn courage. Amid the chaos of fire and metal, one soldier stood at the heart of it all, Lieutenant Marcus Hale, a young man whose uniform was scorched and whose eyes burned with defiance. He commanded a squad of infantry aboard the defense frigate Resolute, shouting orders through the smoke while explosions rocked the hull. The ship shuddered under the weight of alien plasma strikes and alarms howled across every corridor, yet Hale pressed on, determined to fight to the last breath. The Threx soldiers, boarded with ruthless efficiency, tall reptilian beings with jagged armor and cruel eyes that glowed in the darkness. Hale met them head-on, his rifle spitting fire as he led his squad through the tight passageways, forcing the invaders back step by step. Blood and smoke stained the air, human and alien falling side by side, but the tide was impossible to turn. The Threx numbered in hundreds, swarming through every breach while the humans dwindled to a handful. Hale fought like a man possessed, slamming the butt of his rifle into a snarling face, pulling a fallen comrade to safety, refusing to surrender even as the ship crumbled around him. At last the inevitable came. Surrounded, weapon gone, Hale stood, panting with his fists clenched, his uniform torn and his face streaked with ash. The aliens laughed in their guttural tongue, mocking the last human who still stood on the broken deck. They had orders to capture at least one of the strange warriors alive, and Hale, with his unyielding stare and his refusal to kneel, was dragged in chains toward their transport. He spat blood on the floor but walked without stumbling, even when beaten. The Threx guards exchanged puzzled glances, for prisoners usually begged or wailed, but this human marched as though he were still the commander of a fleet. The journey to the prison world was long, a blur of cold metal cells and humming engines. Yet Hale's resolve never cracked. He studied every face of his captors, memorized every detail of the ship, every routine, every flicker of weakness. He did not speak unless he chose to, and when he finally did, his words carried weight. One young alien guard tried to taunt him, asking why humans resisted when surrender was easier. Hale simply answered, "Because we are human and surrender is not in our blood." The guard said nothing after that. Finally, they arrived at the place the galaxy whispered about in fear. The Black Bastion, a prison built in the hollowed remains of a dead moon. The fortress hung in space like a scar, its towers bristling with weapons and its shields glowing like fire. Here, warlords, assassins, rebels, and traitors were locked away never to return. No prisoner had ever escaped, no uprising had ever succeeded, and every empire respected the bastion as unbreakable. When Hale was marched through its gates, the alien wardens jeered, calling him fragile, calling him soft, saying he would not last a week. But Marcus only smiled faintly and walked onward, each step firm and deliberate. Inside the bastion, the corridors were dark and endless, the air thick with the stench of despair. Cells lined the walls, each one holding creatures from countless worlds, eyes glowing from the shadows as they watched the new arrival. Hale felt their gaze but did not falter. He was pushed into a narrow chamber of steel where the door clanged shut behind him. Yet instead of sinking into defeat, he sat calmly on the hard floor and began to plan. He studied the seams of the walls, the rhythm of the guards' footsteps. Outside, the faint hum of energy fields that locked the cells. Every detail was a piece of a puzzle, and Hale's mind worked like a blade carving through chains. The Threx believed they had captured a broken soldier, a trophy to prove their dominance. They did not see that in seizing Marcus Hale they had carried fire into their own fortress. The bastion had swallowed countless prisoners over the centuries, but now for the first time in its history, it had devoured a human who would not bow and who would never accept defeat. The walls around him seemed unshakable, the guards invincible, the reputation of the prison unchallenged. Yet Hale's eyes gleamed with something that no iron bars could contain. It was the quiet promise that he would not only survive this place, but one day he would rise and bring the fortress to its knees. The prison of no return. The Black Bastion was more than a prison. It was a monument to fear, a place designed to crush hope before it could even spark. The corridors stretched like endless veins of steel, filled with shadows and the echo of footsteps, while the walls carried the weight of centuries of suffering. Marcus Hale was led deeper into its core, past cells that held creatures of every shape and size, from hulking brutes with iron scales to frail insect-like beings whose eyes glimmered with madness. Each prisoner watched the human with curiosity, some sneering, some whispering in their own languages, and some with the weary gaze of those who had seen everything and no longer cared. Hale walked with steady steps, his head unbowed, refusing to give the guards the satisfaction of seeing weakness. His cell was a narrow chamber carved from black alloy, a slab of stone for a bed, a single line of light that flickered overhead. The door sealed with a hiss, and silence fell like a weight. For many, this silence was the worst of tortures, the emptiness that hollowed out the soul. For Hale, it was a moment to think. He traced the grooves in the wall with his eyes, listened to the hum of the force field beyond the bars, counted the footsteps of the guards as they patrolled. Every detail mattered, and Marcus Hale was a soldier trained to see what others ignored. The guards treated him with disdain, tossing his rations through the barrier, laughing as if he were a beast in a cage. They whispered to one another about how soft humans were, how fragile their bodies, how quickly they would break under confinement. One guard even wagered he would last only 3 cycles before begging for release. Hale ignored them. He ate quietly, conserved his strength, and when the lights dimmed, he trained his body with silent discipline, push-ups and squats and stretches, turning his cell into a battlefield of the mind where surrender had no place. As days bled into nights, Hale began to notice the patterns of the bastion. The guards walked their rounds with military precision, but they were overconfident, their routines predictable. The food came at the same hour each cycle. The light dimmed at the same interval. The energy hum of the barriers fluctuated in faint rhythms that no one else seemed to hear. Most prisoners had given up long ago, content to rot in despair, but Hale's eyes were alive, studying, cataloging, preparing. Word spread among the other inmates about the human. They spoke through the vents, through coded knocks on the walls, through whispered greetings when dragged into the corridors. Some laughed at him, saying he was only delaying the inevitable. Others watched with cautious interest. When Hale endured a brutal beating from a guard who struck him for standing too straight, he did not cry out, and when he rose again with blood on his face but fire in his eyes, whispers spread like wildfire. The human did not break. The human stood. Among the prisoners were beings who had once led rebellions, who had commanded armies, who had seen hope crushed again and again. To them, Hale was a curiosity, a spark in the dark. They questioned him, when they could, asking about Earth, about humanity, about why he did not surrender. His answers were simple. We endure because we must, we fight because there is no other way, we live because giving up is death before death. His words carried weight not because they were loud, but because they were true. Even the guards began to notice in their own way. One sneered that humans were stubborn mules refusing to admit their weakness. Another muttered that this one had the eyes of a predator, not of prey. They laughed, but their laughter carried unease. The Black Bastion was used to crushing spirits quickly, yet this human only grew stronger in silence. One evening, as Hale sat on his slab of stone, he heard a faint knock through the wall. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 more. He answered with the same rhythm. Slowly, a code began to form between him and the cell next to his, an old rebel warlord who had been locked away for decades. Through whispers and knocks, Hale learned of secret passages, of failed uprisings, of guards who could be bribed and guards who could not. He learned that the bastion had weaknesses, tiny cracks hidden in its armor, overlooked because no one had lived long enough to exploit them. Hale listened, learned, and remembered. Every word was another piece of the puzzle he was assembling in his mind. He knew he could not act yet. Patience was his ally, haste his enemy. For now he would build alliances, quietly, gain trust slowly, and prepare for the day when the bastion itself would tremble. The aliens believed they had trapped a fragile human in their strongest prison, but the truth was different. They had delivered their fortress into the hands of a soldier who saw cages not as walls but as challenges, who saw despair not as defeat but as fuel. Hale lay down that night on the cold slab with eyes still burning, and in that moment the Bastion did not realize it had taken its first step toward ruin. The human spirit days turned into weeks inside the Black Bastion and Marcus. Hale adapted to its rhythm with the patience of a soldier who knew that survival was more than just breathing. He rose when the light strip flickered on. He exercised when the silence grew too heavy. He ate the bland rations without complaint, and he endured the jeers and strikes of the guards without breaking his stance. What set him apart was not the strength of his body but the refusal of his spirit to bend. The other prisoners began to notice this more than anything else. They had seen champions and killers arrive with fire in their eyes, only to wither under the crushing monotony of the Bastion. They had seen leaders boast of escape and freedom only to cry themselves into silence after a month. But this human was different. He carried himself with the same posture he had on the battlefield, as if his uniform was still crisp and his squad was still beside him, and even in chains his back never slouched. One day the guards decided to test him in front of others. They dragged him into the common chamber where prisoners were sometimes allowed brief exercise. The Threx captain ordered Hale to kneel, and when he refused, 3 guards struck him with their shock batons until sparks burned across his skin. Hale fell to one knee but refused to stay down. Slowly, painfully, he rose again, blood dripping from his mouth, but his eyes steady as stone. The prisoners who watched held their breath. The guards struck him again, harder this time. Yet once more he stood tall. The alien captain snarled and mocked him, saying humans were too foolish to know when they were beaten, but his words carried less power than the silence that followed. Every prisoner in the chamber saw the human rise again, and in their hearts something stirred that they had long forgotten. Hope was a dangerous thing inside the Bastion, but Marcus Hale carried it with him like a weapon no guard could confiscate. When the guards finally tired of their game and threw him back into his cell, the whispers spread faster than fire. They whispered of the human who would not kneel, the human who took punishment and rose without fear, the human who seemed unbreakable. Some prisoners scoffed, claiming it was only stubborn pride, but even they watched him with cautious respect. Others began to speak with him more directly through the vents and coded knocks. A hulking beast from the southern cell, covered in scars, offered him food he had hidden for months. An insectoid strategist who once led fleets shared fragments of old maps of the Bastion carved into the wall with his claws. Slowly, without shouting, without demanding, Hale became a figure that others looked toward, not because he asked to lead, but because he proved himself through action. The guards remained blind to the shift. They thought the laughter and whispers were aimed at mocking the human, not realizing that the tide of the prison was beginning to turn. Their arrogance blinded them. Their belief in the Bastion's invincibility made them careless, and in that arrogance, Hale saw his opening. Every day he studied not only the walls and the guards, but also the prisoners themselves. He saw who was broken, who still had fire, who could be trusted, who might betray for scraps of food or favor. He understood that if freedom was to be possible, he could not do it alone. He needed allies, and in the darkest corners of the Bastion, he began to gather them without ever declaring it aloud. The alien prisoners who once looked at humans as weak began to question their beliefs. They asked Hale how humans could endure such pain without yielding. His answer was always the same: because we are human and we refuse to die on our knees. That answer echoed in their minds long after he spoke it. Some began to mimic his exercises, in their cells pushing their frail bodies to remember strength. Others began to talk of escape once more, though quietly, as if saying the word too loud might break the fragile dream. What Hale gave them was not a plan yet, not even a promise, but something greater. He gave them a reason to believe that even the strongest fortress could fall, that even the most unbreakable chain could snap, that a human soldier could walk into the heart of despair and turn it into a battlefield. He did not roar or preach. He simply endured, and endurance in the Bastion was more revolutionary than violence. That night, as he lay on his stone bed listening to the faint breathing of the prison, Hale allowed himself the smallest of smiles. The bastion thought it had swallowed him whole, but in truth it had only sharpened him. He could feel the shift in the air, the eyes of the prisoners that now watched him with something more than curiosity. They watched him with faith. The human spirit, born in fire and tempered by struggle, had taken root inside the fortress of despair. It was still only a seed, fragile and unseen by most, but Hale knew seeds could split stone given time. The first move. The bastion believed itself eternal, but Marcus Hale had spent every day searching for the first crack in its armor. He had memorized the timing of the guard rotations, the way the energy barriers flickered ever so slightly when the generators shifted, the moments when the silence of the corridors stretched too long. He knew now that the fortress was not perfect, only arrogant, and arrogance was the seed of downfall. The prisoners had begun to look to him not as a broken man but as a leader, though he never claimed such a role. Leadership was not something he asked for. It was something others gave him when they saw him endure. The time had come to test whether that faith could become action. It began with a guard who underestimated him. The Threx soldier opened the barrier to throw in the usual ration, his posture lazy, his attention elsewhere. Hale moved not with rage but with precision, speaking words of gratitude as he accepted the tray. His hand brushed the guard's wrist, with seeming accident, but in truth he was testing reflexes, weight, speed. The alien shoved him back with a snarl, but Hale smiled faintly and returned to his stone slab. The guard laughed at the idea of a prisoner thanking him, not realizing he had already been measured like a target on the battlefield. Later that cycle, when the lights dimmed, Hale began to test another limit. He pressed his palm against the energy field of the barrier until the heat scorched his skin. The pain was searing, but in that pain he found rhythm. The field pulsed faintly, not steady as the guards believed, but in waves. He counted the intervals with the precision of a soldier timing artillery strikes. The skin of his hand blistered, yet he did not stop until he had the count burned into his memory. That night he whispered the pattern through the wall to the rebel warlord who listened with keen ears. The warlord hissed in surprise, admitting that even in decades of imprisonment he had not noticed such detail. Hale only replied that humans had a way of finding weaknesses in anything, no matter how small. The next step came with alliances. The insectoid strategist carved a crude map of the bastion on the wall of his cell, marking where supply drones entered and where maintenance shafts led. Hale studied it carefully, cross-checking it with what he had observed. He found inconsistencies, and when he pointed them out, the insectoid chittered in admiration. Soon others joined in the exchange of knowledge, each adding fragments of memory, until Hale held in his mind a rough blueprint of the fortress. To the guards he remained the stubborn human who refused to kneel, but beneath that mask he was weaving a network of trust. He spoke softly to those who had been forgotten, telling them that freedom was not impossible, only costly. Some laughed bitterly, saying the bastion had crushed rebellions before. Hale reminded them that none of those rebellions had been led by humans, and though they scoffed, his words lingered. The first true act of defiance came when Hale baited a guard into striking him during ration duty. He took the blow with a grunt and staggered back, then let the strike knock the tray across the floor. The scraps of food slid into the next cell where the scarred beast reached out hungrily. Hale pretended to curse in frustration, distracting the guard long enough for the beast to hide a sharp shard of metal beneath his bulk. It was small, barely more than a sliver, but to Hale it was the first tool, the first weapon, the first tangible piece of rebellion. That night, as silence spread across the bastion, Hale whispered instructions through the walls. The shard would be hidden, passed carefully between allies, used to test locks, to carve signals, to scratch deeper maps. It was a beginning so small the guards could not possibly notice, but in the heart of the prison, it was as if a spark had leapt into dry wood. The prisoners listened with new hunger in their voices, their despair tempered by the human's steady confidence. The bastion still loomed like an unbreakable mountain. Its guards still laughed at the thought of escape, but Marcus Hale had made his first move. It was not loud, it was not dramatic, but it was deliberate. He knew better than to rush, for war was not won by reckless charges, but by patient strikes at the right moment. Tonight, he had begun the war for the Bastion. A war the aliens did not even know had started. Fire in the fortress. The Bastion had stood for centuries as a monument to control, but within its steel veins something new began to move, something the guards did not yet see but the prisoners felt in the air. Marcus Hale had planted the seed of resistance, and now it spread in whispers and glances, in secret knocks against the walls, in fragments of stolen metal passed hand to hand. What had once been silence became a living pulse as the prisoners began to believe that perhaps this fortress was not eternal, that perhaps chains could be broken after all. Hale knew that timing was everything. He was not reckless, and he did not allow desperation to rule him. Every action had to be deliberate, measured, as if he were commanding a battlefield. The shard of metal had been tested on locks and barriers, carving faint marks into the walls to chart patrol routes. And with each test, Hale's understanding of the Bastion grew sharper. The insectoid strategist offered plans, the scarred beast offered strength, the old rebel warlord offered experience, and Hale bound them together with the quiet authority of a man who would not fail. The moment of ignition came when a supply drone malfunctioned. The machines brought rations through narrow passages and one sputtered as sparks danced from its side. Hale's eyes caught it instantly. To the guards, it was only a minor annoyance, a glitch in the machinery of the fortress, but to Hale it was opportunity. He watched carefully as they dragged it away for repairs, memorizing the shaft it entered, the door it passed, the code the guard entered without care. That single moment was a map etched into his mind. When the night cycle came, he whispered his plan through the walls. They would not strike tomorrow or the next day, but soon, when all the pieces aligned. The rebels listened, their voices tight, with anticipation. Hale told them not to think of freedom yet, but only of the first fire, for once the fire was lit, it would spread whether the guards wished it or not. The guards, blinded by arrogance, continued their routines. They mocked Hale during exercise, calling him fragile, daring him to strike back. He never did, but he studied their movements, their weapons, their arrogance, turning their cruelty into intelligence. When one guard shoved him hard against the wall, Hale let his hand brush the control panel of the door, feeling the faint vibration of its circuits. He stored the sensation away like a soldier storing ammunition. Then came the night when everything aligned. The shard had grown into several crude tools, sharpened edges hidden inside bunks, slivers of alloy concealed in clothing. The prisoners were ready. Hale sat on his slab as calm as if preparing for sleep, but his heart beat like war drums. When the light dimmed, he gave the signal. 3 knocks against the wall followed by silence. The scarred beast roared from his cell, loud enough to draw the guards. They rushed in, cursing and laughing at the commotion, opening the barrier to strike him down. In that moment, Hale moved. He jammed one of the hidden shards into the lock mechanism of his own cell, just as the energy field pulsed. Sparks erupted. The hum faltered, and with a surge of effort he forced the barrier open. The guards turned too late. Hale was upon them, moving with the speed of a soldier who had waited too long for battle. He seized one by the throat, slammed him against the wall, tore the weapon from his grip and turned it against the others. Prisoners erupted in shouts and screams as the sound of combat echoed through the corridors. The Bastion, which had been silent for years, now shook with the first notes of chaos. Hale freed the scarred beast, then the warlord, then others as the fire spread from cell to cell. Weapons were seized, alarms blared, red light bathed the halls, and for the first time in centuries the Bastion trembled. Guards scrambled in confusion, shouting orders, but every step they took was hindered by prisoners who refused to kneel any longer. The fortress was not theirs anymore. It was becoming a battlefield, and Hale was its commander. As he led the charge through the corridors, his voice rang above the chaos, steady and unbroken. He did not shout promises of freedom. He did not waste words on glory. He simply called commands clear and sharp, guiding prisoners as if they were soldiers in formation. They obeyed because his eyes carried certainty, because his presence made them believe they could win. The Bastion was burning from within, its order shattered by a human soldier who refused to break. Fire spread in every sense, fire in the alarms, fire in the hearts of prisoners, fire in the panic of guards who realized their eternal fortress was crumbling. Marcus Hale had struck the first true blow, and though the war for the bastion had only begun, the fortress would never again know silence. The breakout, the alarms of the bastion wailed like the cries of dying beasts, and the red lights painted, every corridor in blood as chaos consumed the fortress. Marcus Hale moved through the storm with the calm of a soldier who had lived his entire life for this moment. Around him, prisoners surged forward in waves, freed from their cages by shards of metal, stolen keys, and sheer will. The guards fought back with shock batons and plasma rifles, but their discipline shattered in the face of fury that had been caged for decades. Hale directed the riot as if it were a battlefield, his commands cutting through the noise, guiding the rage into strategy. The scarred beast smashed through doors like living artillery, his roar shaking the steel halls. The insectoid strategist scuttled along the walls, shouting positions and weaknesses of the guards in high-pitched tones. The rebel warlord wielded a stolen rifle with the precision of a veteran, striking targets before they could regroup. Each prisoner brought something to the fight, but it was Hale who bound them together, his voice steady and his movements sure, never wasting a step, never hesitating. The guards quickly realized this was no mindless riot. They shouted in panic to seal the upper levels, to activate containment fields, but Hale had already anticipated their moves. He led his fighters into maintenance shafts, narrow and dark, where numbers counted for little and courage counted for everything. In those shafts, the human's endurance and his allies' desperation gave them the edge. They crawled through smoke and flame, emerging behind squads of guards who were unprepared for enemies to appear from the walls themselves. Weapons were seized, armor stripped, and for every guard who fell, another prisoner took up arms. The bastion was built to withstand fleets from outside, but it was never designed to fight a war within its own heart. Doors jammed, power conduits overloaded. Fire spread where prisoners hurled stolen explosives. Hale adapted at every turn, seizing the chaos and shaping it. Where others might have fled blindly, he chose choke points, barricades, ambushes. His mind worked like a blade-carving order from madness. Prisoners followed because they saw him bleed and keep moving, because he fought beside them, not above them, because he treated them as comrades and not as tools. A turning point came when the Threx captain who had first mocked Hale entered the fray with his elite guard. They stormed into a central chamber where dozens of prisoners fought hand to hand. The captain pointed at Hale and bellowed for his capture. The clash that followed was brutal. Plasma fire lit the room, bodies fell, and in the center, Hale met the captain head-on. The alien towered over him with jagged armor and strength bred for war, but Hale fought with the fury of a man who carried not only his own freedom, but the hope of hundreds. He ducked under a swing, slammed the butt of his rifle into the captain's jaw, then drove a blade into the weak joint of the armor. The alien howled but still pressed forward, claws tearing into Hale's side, yet the human refused to fall. With a final surge, he wrenched the captain's own weapon free and fired point-blank into his chest, dropping him like a collapsing tower. The sight sent a shockwave through the chamber, prisoners roaring in triumph as the guards faltered. The uprising spread beyond control. Entire blocks of cells opened, entire wings of the bastion burned. Hale kept pushing, never letting the momentum fade, always moving toward the core where the main control systems lay. He knew that if they could reach the control hub, they could disable the lockdown protocols and open the bastion fully to the void of space, or to escape ships if any could be seized. The path was lined with fire and blood, but he never hesitated, and his allies never doubted. The fortress that had once been unbreakable was cracking with every step. Guards who once laughed now screamed in fear. Prisoners who once despaired now fought with wild courage. The name Marcus Hale spread through the chaos like a battle hymn. The bastion was no longer a prison. It had become a war zone, and Hale was turning it into a victory. The breakout was no longer a dream whispered in the dark. It was happening. And the galaxy's most feared fortress trembled under the boots of a single human who refused to kneel. The fall of the fortress, the bastion, roared with fire as alarms screamed and walls shook under the weight of rebellion. Marcus Hale led his makeshift army through the smoking corridors, every step taking them closer to the control hub at the heart of the fortress. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of burned circuitry, but to Hale it smelled like victory, waiting to be claimed. His body ached from wounds. His side burned from where the Threx captain had struck him, yet his eyes were steady and his movements sharp. He knew he could not stop now because behind him hundreds followed his lead, and if he faltered, the fire would die. The guards had gathered for a final stand. They lined the entrance to the hub with heavy rifles and energy shields, their faces grim as they realized the fortress they had thought eternal was on the edge of ruin. Hale raised his fist, and the prisoners fell silent. He did not give a speech. He did not promise freedom. He only said one word: forward. With that, the charge began. The battle for the control hub was a storm of steel and blood. Plasma fire lit the chamber as prisoners hurled themselves against the line of guards. The scarred beast plowed through like a living wall, ripping rifles from alien hands and smashing shields apart. The insectoid strategist shouted coordinates, marking weak points for others to strike. The rebel warlord moved with the precision of an old general, covering Hale's flank as he drove toward the core. Every step was paid in blood, but the line broke under the relentless will of those who had been caged too long. At last, Hale reached the control systems, a towering array of consoles and glowing panels guarded by the last desperate squad of Threx soldiers. He tore a weapon from a fallen enemy and fired without pause, cutting through them one by one until the console was his. With hands steady despite the chaos around him, he began pressing controls, guided by the memory of every detail he had learned, every pattern he had studied. The energy fields flickered and then died. The gates of the bastion unlocked and doors across the fortress slid open like wounds splitting wide. A roar thundered from every corridor as prisoners realized the fortress was no longer sealed. The bastion had been broken. Guards who had once mocked and laughed now fled in terror, hunted by those they had tormented for years. The prisoners surged through the open halls, some seeking vengeance, some seeking freedom, all driven by the fire that Hale had lit. But Hale was not finished. He knew that escape meant nothing if the fortress itself still stood as a threat. With help from the insectoid strategist, he redirected power flows, forcing the overloaded generators to spiral toward collapse. The bastion began to shudder as explosions rocked its foundations. The walls cracked, flames poured from vents, and the fortress that had been called eternal now began to die. Hale led his people to the hangar where supply ships and patrol craft were kept. The guards tried to hold the bay, but their numbers were broken, their courage spent, and the tide of prisoners swept them aside. Hale climbed aboard a transport, his hands gripping the controls though he had never flown this model before. He was a soldier, and soldiers adapted. The engines roared to life, and one by one ships lifted off, spilling into the black sky. Behind them, the bastion burned like a dying star, its towers collapsing, its shields gone, its reputation shattered forever. Hale guided the transport away, watching as the prison that had caged generations crumbled into ruin. The prisoners around him stared in silence at the sight, some with tears, some with laughter, some with awe. They had been broken for so long that freedom felt unreal, yet here they were, alive and unchained because one human had refused to kneel. Hale stood among them, his uniform torn, his body bruised, but his spirit untouched. He looked at the stars ahead and knew the galaxy would hear of this night. They would hear that the unbreakable bastion had fallen not to fleets or empires, but to a single soldier and the fire he carried within. As the prison world collapsed behind him, Marcus Hale closed his eyes for a moment, hearing the voices of his fallen comrades, feeling the weight of the battle still on his shoulders. Then he opened them again, sharp and steady, ready for whatever lay ahead. The galaxy would not forget this day, and the Threx would never again underestimate humanity. One man had destroyed their strongest fortress, and now the legend of the human spirit would spread across the stars like fire. The bastion was no longer a fortress, but a dying beast thrashing against its own wounds. Fire tore through its veins, steel collapsed into molten rivers, and alarms wailed like the last breaths of a broken empire. Marcus Hale stood in the middle of it all with his chest heaving, his face scarred, his body covered in blood and smoke, yet his eyes were alive with unshakable resolve. Around him prisoners followed with a fervor that came not from orders but from faith. Faith in a man who had turned despair into defiance. The final stand came at the gates of the control hub where the Threx elite waited with rifles ready. The prisoners slowed, trembling at the sight of heavy weapons, but Hale did not falter. He raised his hand and with a single word forward he led them into the storm. The clash was thunder, steel against steel, energy bolts flashing across the chamber, screams echoing against the walls. Hale fought like a man who knew there was no tomorrow unless this battle was won, each strike driven by the weight of every fallen comrade and every broken soul within these walls. Through smoke and chaos he reached the consoles, his hands moving across controls as though he had trained for this moment all his life. Energy fields sputtered and died. Gates unlocked and doors across the bastion burst open. A roar rose from every corridor as prisoners surged into freedom. The guards who had laughed for centuries now fled, their confidence shattering as they saw their eternal fortress collapsing around them. The bastion groaned under the strain as Hale forced its reactors into overload. Explosions rumbled through the core, tearing through foundations once thought unbreakable. He led the survivors to the hangar, guiding them onto ships they had never dreamed they would see again. The scarred beast lifted a fallen comrade with gentle strength. The insectoid strategist hissed directions for the ships. The rebel warlord saluted Hale with eyes that held both gratitude and awe. Engines roared to life, ships rising into the black sky as the bastion crumbled behind them. What had stood for centuries as a symbol of dominance now burned like a star consumed by its own pride. From the viewport Hale watched it fall, his breath steady, his heart unyielding. Around him prisoners wept and cheered, their voices breaking, with disbelief their chains gone at last. The galaxy would hear of this day, of the prison that had never fallen, of the fortress that had swallowed thousands, and of the one human soldier who tore it apart from within. The name Marcus Hale would spread through every system, whispered in fear by the Threx and spoken with reverence by those who longed for freedom. Humanity had once been underestimated, mocked, dismissed as fragile, but now they would be remembered as the fire that no cage could contain. Marcus Hale stood at the edge of the hangar bay window, his eyes fixed on the stars stretching before him. He carried no crown, no title, no reward, only the knowledge that he had kept faith with his people and with himself. He had endured the unendurable, and by enduring, he had won. Behind him, the bastion vanished in a blaze that shook the heavens, a final proof that even the strongest chains break when struck by the human spirit. The end